I think we can applaud the president for attempting to reduce the cabinet, the size of the cabinet. But we as APA would argue that he could have done even more. And then maybe it's a question of what is the approach to be used in order to reduce cabinet. We saw a little bit, and I will illustrate our approach and acknowledge that the president actually did something which began to signal that he is aware of the methodology that can be used. I noticed that I think he's put international trade with foreign affairs, which makes a lot of sense. We as APA would have gone further, and I will use that same department, if you like. At the moment, foreign affairs is a cost center, but international trade and tourism are to do with international affairs, actually. And therefore, there is nothing to stop a government that is focused on reducing the cost of government and governance, combining those three functions: tourism, international affairs, and international trade. I would have put those three together. The other thing that APA is very clear about is that we as a sub-region, and I want to cluster very specific countries. If you take our history of the liberation struggle and you look at Tanzania, Mozambique, Zambia, and Zimbabwe, and the Malawi included just by virtue of where it sits, and I'm not excluding, I want to illustrate a principle, that's why I named those countries. These countries have got a very rich history in terms of solidarity and how we fought the liberation struggle. Where we have failed, it is to use exactly that history to create an approach to industrialization where we create a bigger domestic market, a bigger economy based on our history. I am absolutely convinced, and the APA is in this space, that when you take those countries that I've just named and you approach them and they use the platform of our history, we could reconfigure our economies to create one economy which is of significance as a domestic economy. In other words, let me just name the countries again: Tanzania, Mozambique, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Malawi. And of course, this would be the nucleus of something which would get bigger as you then include Botswana, Namibia, DRC, and South Africa. My perception is that South Africa would probably, for the time being, really not understand how this needs to be done. Let me be illustrative. We've got Dunlop in Zimbabwe and in Bulawayo, which is struggling. If you take that cluster of countries and you want to create a cluster which, on the basis of which you develop industrialization built on a significant domestic economy, then a Dunlop in Zimbabwe should not be replicated in the other countries. But in order for that to work, you have then to look at the economies of the other countries and look at how you make them complementary, so that as Zimbabwe sells tires to that cluster of countries without them also producing tires, you need to be able to identify what you're going to buy from them. That is a very smart architecture of what economic integration looks like. It also creates scale for each one of the countries' bases where they've got competitive advantage for them to then complement each other and create one domestic economy. So what am I leading to? It means, as I look at regional integration, I would then look at industrialization and the cluster, or what we call industry, in my mind, reconfigure that industrialization for the sub-region. And I want to create domestic, what is now a different domestic market on the base of these countries, not competing but complementing each other. So I would put in industry regional integration. That's how APA looks at how you reduce the size of cabinet by clustering functions or departments of government that belong together. It is not difficult to do, but we need to have incredible clarity. Then the other way to deal with this, remember that in the upper we've also said we would scrap deputy ministers. The way to do it is that if a cluster of functions becomes too broad, you can very easily have more than one permanent secretary under one minister to cater for the broad nature of that clustering of ministries. That is the upper idea of how to reduce the size of cabinet. Like I say, we saw just a little attempt at doing this, but not enough. The second component, which is absolutely critical to how you reduce government, is decentralization or devolution, as it is in fact already catered for in our constitution. A lot of functions that have been centralized at central government level need to be pushed back into the provinces and through a process of devolution, so that at the top you retain only those functions that are required at a nationwide level. Defense, for instance, cannot be devolved. But ministries such as health and education, to a very large degree, if you look at examples of other countries, can be pushed lower down so that your devolution is properly configured to complement what happens at provincial level and what happens at national level, with only those functions that are really absolutely necessary at central government level to be retained and everything else to be pushed further down the line. But I know that although devolution is provided for in our constitution, at the moment it appears to us that there is very little appetite for implementing it. We don't understand why this is the case. We've got a constitution that already provides for it, and that constitution and that the implementation of devolution, we believe, will create more accountability at the levels where we require it to be. So that is, in short, some of what we read in what has happened. Disappointment, which I would like to persuade the people on this call to actually start flip it and look at the flip side and say, actually for the opposition parties, this is a godsend, because it means we do not get diverted into trying to run an administration which we don't really own, but we can stay focused in preparing ourselves for the upcoming elections and make sure that our articulation of what we stand for is heard by the people as they prepare to choose who should lead our country into the future. As to the quality of the cabinet, I would rather not discuss. I leave it to you as citizens of this country. You know the individuals who are in that cabinet. If we are looking at meritocracy and looking at absolute delivery, looking at people who know what they're doing, and minimizing, not totally ignoring, but minimizing politics and accentuating capacity to deliver, then I think there could be a conversation to be had whether that balance has been struck or not. We in UPA think rather not. We would have pushed that balance into much more technical managers who know what needs to be done and can deliver to give our country confidence. And on that issue, let me touch on an issue which bothers us in UPA. In our conversations, we've argued that independent Africa has colonized the youth more than the white man or the colonizer ever did. Not easy to quite understand at first, but let me explain. The way we've run our countries post-independence has created a feeling in young people through what they experience. So what do? We take our children and send them to schools which were previously white schools. We take our families and send them into private hospitals that largely, when you look across the continent, are actually owned and run by white people. We take our own people, from our own people, I should say, let me correct that. We tend to take people who are highly politicized, but less competent in terms of technical capacity, and we give them responsibility to run our institutions, such as Air Zimbabwe, for instance. Look at our hospitals. And what we then achieve is that where we've placed black managers, the institutions slowly disappear. In performance, they become second rate, if not third rate. We, the same people that are responsible for administration, then don't send our own families into those institutions. We don't send our children into those institutions. Inadvertently, we are signaling to the youth and our children that the only thing that continues to function properly on our continent is that is run by a white man. And what we run ourselves, because of the manner in which we do it, ceases to perform. Now, we are doing much more damage psychologically to our own people by not building confidence through what we do and how we do things. This needs to be reversed. If we don't do this, not only our economy is going to suffer, but the damage which is invisible, which is taking place, is that psychologically, we are socializing our youth and our children to believe that we are not good enough. This is incredibly undesirable. So it is really important for any administration that runs any African country to understand that it is time. It is time we got our own competent people who are there in numbers to run our institutions and demonstrate to our youth that we can do this and give them confidence. Let me give you an example. So recently, maybe a couple of months ago, I went to the UK and I had a meeting with professionals in the UK. Amongst these professionals, there were a few specialized doctors. And one of the lady specialist doctors told me that out of a class of about 65 Zimbabwean, a class of 65 medical students in Zimbabwe, 43 of them now are specialists in the UK. It's an investment that Zimbabwe did in educating all these people. Zimbabweans as a people are capable of achieving these high levels of performance. But for whatever reason, when we then look at creating opportunities for employing our own people who we've spent a lot of money educating, we don't find it appropriate or necessary to create the space for them to find satisfactory deployment in our society. So what do? They take off and go to other countries. They are in the UK in huge numbers, both nurses and doctors, people in finance. Look at South Africa. So we cannot pretend that we don't have the people with the skills, but we need to re-examine how we form our administrations, both in terms of performance and also in terms of role modeling. Let's begin to address this issue and take our own people who have invested, their families have invested, we as a nation have invested, but we don't create opportunities for them to excel simply because they prefer to say, I'll join MDC, I'll join APA rather than ZANU. Or I will not join a political party at all. I am a professional, but I'm available. We overlook them and go only to those people who join political parties. I think this is wrong. And APA is very clear that our members have to understand that when we win the next election, which we absolutely intend to do, we are going to look at the talent that is Zimbabwean, not the talent that resides in APA, but the talent that is Zimbabwean. And it is the talent that we're going to create opportunity spaces for in order for that talent to help us build our country, irrespective of what party they go to, what church they belong to, what age they are. In fact, maybe let me correct the last bit. We will absolutely pay attention to the age issue and create space for our youth, as we've already articulated, that we need youth ministers or youthful ministers to essentially deliver two things. Innovation comes from young people. I think this, I don't have to debate or convince anybody. I hope that you're all aware of this. We want innovation in our nation. We have to create space for young people. We have to create space for young people right up at the top so that they can push and test the system and say, why do we continue to do things in an archaic way simply because the old people are in their comfort zone? Young people will show us and push us into newer spaces and technologies, innovative ways of doing things. But it's also important for us to create spaces for young people so that they can begin to learn from the experience that the older generation brings to the table. And again, I don't believe that the last cabinet shows sufficient evidence or sensitivity to creating space, in fact, in three areas, let's say: technocrats, women, and the youth. I would say as upper, look to what we're going to do when we win. All of these things will be attended to. We'll shrink the cabinet to make sure that the cost of government is not disproportionate to the size of our economy. We'll go for a 50-50 gender balance to make sure that the other half of our population, the women, are catered for and they can contribute. They are a huge asset which we're failing to use. We'll create space for the youth in order to cater for innovation and also mentorship in, or apprenticeship, if you like, learning on the job. These are my takeaways from what has just happened, where I believe that our new president could have done better in putting together his cabinet. Let me see some questions and comments that are coming in.